Hello, my name is John Brink. I'm podcasting a solo on the economy in Canada and the United States, but in particular as it relates to the forest industry, with all the complexities around that, both in Canada, in particular in BC, and vis-a-vis the forest industry in the US Southeast, where in the southern yellow pine, and then the economic struggles that the industry collectively have, both in Canada and BC in particular, and the US Southeast as well, directly relating to the economy. So that being said, I have to lay a bit of a foundation that I have been in the forest industry in Canada since 1965. Started working as a cleanup man, lumber pilot, and then in 1975 started a lumber company. And already my background before that was in Europe for about 10 years, and in particular in lumber manufacturing. And I loved lumber manufacturing, so my dream was to go to Canada and build a lumber mill. Starting in with nothing, which I did. In 1975, started a company. In particular, the first thing that I did, work in a lumber mill in the Prince George region, where all the lumber mills were then. And the first thing that struck me when I came here, started working as a cleanup man in a lumber mill, I looked at the burner conveyor and all the fiber going and the timber going up in the conveyor into the burner. And that was 1965. It hadn't been much before that when the government decided and did a study actually by a local firm, Industrial Forest Service, that still is in existence today, and asked them to do a study as to what was the recovery of lumber from timber and justify making a case to people invest in pulp mills. They did the study, and what was the recovery? They concluded that the recovery from lumber, from trees, from timber, was 25%. The rest was going up the burner. Shocking? Yes. The other part that I noticed then is that the amazing quality of timber, in particularly in northern BC, where I was working, the SPF, spruce pine balsam fir, is an amazing quality of fiber, especially suited for building framework for houses and other commodities that needed that consistency of quality. And it was, in my opinion, very similar to what I had been used to in Holland when we imported a lot of our lumber and timber from Sweden, Finland, and Russia. And the quality of timber from Sweden was in particular very similar to what we have here in terms of quality. So that being said, I gradually started then already looking at, when I was still piling lumber and became a supervisor, and started thinking about building my own lumber mill, in particular doing value-added manufacturing, of lumber. And then I had to find a way of how would I get, access to fiber. Obviously, I didn't have much money, starting out virtually with nothing, and a bank loan of $25,000 from a local bank, and started with 3 employees working on remanufacturing of lumber, now called value-added manufacturing, or both. And I bought economy dimension or rejects that other people didn't use, and started cutting it up into other pieces. The other part, some people had tried that but were not successful because too many short pieces were left over that could not be utilized. I introduced them as key to my company, Brink Forest Products, in the winter of 1975. I introduced finger jointing, where we take smaller pieces of lumber and glue them together into longer length. Although many people thought, oh, there's no market for it and all of those kind of things, but I did gradually develop a market in the United States, in particular in Texas. So that has been our business model since the last 50 years. Our company started growing. We did other products, make pellets and other products, remanufacturing, wider grade species of lumber, 2x10s into 2x4s, 2x6s, and remanufacturing of lumber. So we started to get to the point of employing close to 400 people in 3 different locations. I still believe today that the future of the forest industry in British Columbia in particular is, although a lot of companies were still manufacturing dimension lumber, 2x4, 2x6, 2x8, 2x10, 2x12 if it's available, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, up to 20. All that beautiful fiber would go into what I call spaghetti. If it looks all over the world, that as the economy already then went through the ups and downs, go all over the world and find places where we could convince them, meaning the buyers, that they should be built houses like we do in British Columbia, and in particular in the north. It's a bit of a joke because we, even before I came to Canada, before 1965, we had a kind of, was comical to us because the Canadian manufacturers from northern BC in particular would come to us, and we loved the Canadians because they liberated us, from during the Second World War. So we loved them and cared about them, but we had a joke that every time the market goes down in the United States, they send their manufacturers down to Holland and say, convince us to build houses like we do here, stick building and using 2x4, 2x6, 2x10, and on and on and on. It was a bit of a joke because we said, as soon as the market comes back in the United States, then they disappeared until the next downturn. I already then believed that there is a huge future in the British Columbia forest industry for added value. We have the fiber, we have the location, meaning the best location in the world. Asia on the one side, Europe on the other side, North America, to our south. And so we have the fiber, we had everything. And the industry started expanding then already in the mid-60s into the mid-70s, pulp mills, sawmills, all over the place. But still producing basically dimension lumber, or what I call spaghetti. With all due respect. But at this point, it's not the time to be nice, but let's really call it what it is. So it became dominated by fewer and fewer companies, which it did to where at one point H.R. McMillan, the first forester of the province of British Columbia, that turned into H.R. McMillan Bodell, the biggest manufacturer in Canada and in BC in particular. And during a royal commission, the Sloan Commission, the one was in 1945, the other one in 1955, he said then on the record that if we continue to consolidate the companies all into bigger and no manufacturing in the regions or in the local communities, then it'd be a very sorry day for the province of British Columbia. And 3 or 4 companies will dominate all the timber in the province. That's what he said on the record, more or less paraphrasing, in 1955. We did allow to become consolidate more and more and more. And although people like me invested in value-added manufacturing, there was little or no support for that. And especially in the early 2000, 2001, 2002, the then the BC Liberals, although they're more like a conservative organization, they just used the name Liberals. Gordon Campbell then was the premier of the province, adopted a policy suggestion from the Council of Forest Industry, which supposedly represents the forest industry in British Columbia. They don't, and even less so now. Obviously, they represent the interest of the biggest due payers, which is still the case today, but was already the case then. So whatever they did, they bring a group together, but at the end of the day, the biggest controlling shareholders and the boardroom table of Kofi were 3 or 4 companies: West Fraser, Canfor, Interfor, some other ones. With all due respect to them, they are owned by shareholders and they have to do the best they can, which is fine. But I have an interest what is happening to us as Canadians and as citizens of British Columbia, in particular also Northern British Columbia, so where I've now been for 60 years. So already in the early 90s, and that brings me now to the dominance of few players that started being a problem to the US producers. And they started working already for a long term, limiting the amount of fiber that was manufactured in Canada and BC in particular, but then by far was the largest producer. They had about 200 sawmills, or sorry, 120 sawmills in the province in still early 2000. But since the 1982, they started putting on duties on lumber imported to the US market. We were then, as secondary manufacturers or value-added manufacturers, using lumber as an input product, not having timber or anything related to that, but rather only lumber as input, making products for the US market in a lot of cases. Brink was one of them. So we started then to form another association, the BC Council of Value-Added Wood Processors. And we had about 8 associations, 800 members that we brought together to argue the point that if the allegations from the United States is that we are being subsidized in timber, then we could say we have no timber, so therefore the input is lumber, which is being marketed globally, including into the United States. So there is no subsidy and there is no benefit or subsidized timber directly relating to value-added manufacturing. We were able to convince the Americans that that was the case, and rather than eliminating the duties, we only pay duties on the input value, or they say first mill, meaning that the transaction between primaries and secondaries, it would be based on the lumber input. If that cost $100, you pay duty on that part, and then if you add value, social and economic value, which we do have to do more of, obviously, then if that was 1,000, you would not pay the duty on the 1,000, you would pay it on the input. Only makes sense. Unfortunately, that negotiated by, and I was the founding chair and the president of the BC Council of Value-Added Wood Processors, that disappeared in the early 2000s under the then government of the BC Liberals. Other things that disappeared is access to other fiber as well. That was eliminated. Pertinency, the concept of manufacturing in the communities where the fiber grows, and then more support to value-added, local value-added manufacturing. That incentive disappeared. And government started to promote selling materials, and again, at the risk of being complicated, with all due respect here, if a sawmill produces 100% of fiber, the traditional sawmill in northern BC, and maybe in other places as well in BC, the lower 25% and the higher 25% is suitable in particular suitable for value-added manufacturing. So that means 50% of the lumber manufactured could be sold or stimulated in the province for value-added manufacturing. But they then decided, that was really never supported by organizations like COFI and the BC Lumber Trade Council. In fact, they started to promote financing of offices in different locations, like areas like Japan, China, and other places that are just interested in products that we manufacture for value-added manufacturing. And again, I see it even today, even our current government, under the influence, obviously, of organizations like COFI and others, are looking at selling product in Japan. Well, Japan, as it always has, is only interested in the high grades. We're looking at China and other places, they're interested in the low grades. I've said over and over and over again for 50 years, let's manufacture that as much as we can in the province, in the regions, preferably in the communities. It would create thousands and thousands of jobs. What the government is doing is, in a naive way, because of the structure, every 4 years we have an election, we then appoint the left or the right, and they then appoint, with all due respect to my friends in government, they appoint a minister of forest that has usually no idea what we're doing and all the bureaucracy around, and every 2 years they change the minister of forest, so barely by the time they find out where to hang their coat and where the washroom is, they have a new one. And so they're being highly influenced by some of the main producers, and in particular an organization that has a bias towards primary manufacturers, not value added. In fact, they will go out of their way, in fact, to discourage value added manufacturers. But I say to those guys, but I say over and over and over again to the incumbent governments in British Columbia, but in probably other parts of the province, open the door, look outside. That's where we have value-added manufacturing. That's where we can do that. And so, so far not overly successful, but here in the regions, in the coast and in the regions here, in northern British Columbia, we used to have 40 value-added manufacturers. Today there are maybe 5, 6 of them, and at least 5 of them, 4 of them, 3 of them, which they weren't there, including me, after 50 years. With our operations in Prince George, Vanderhoof, and Houston, where we operated with 400 employees doing value-added manufacturing, not having timber, not having access, no handouts, no subsidies. So what happened then is that since 2017, when again, under the leadership of organization like COFI, the BC Lumber Trade Council, they again led the negotiations in Ottawa with the Americans for duties as they apply to the lumber manufacturing sectors. For reasons that I cannot imagine even today, they excluded exemption of or partial duties paid on input rather than the export volume. They excluded that because it made it too complicated, and they focused on the primaries. So companies like Brink, that normally operates in Prince George, Houston, and Vanderhoof, employing 400 people, and is a medium-sized company. We paid since 2017, when the duty rate was negotiated and value added was not on the table, we have paid close to $80 million in duties. How can you then survive? How can you? Add to that, then we did. So up to last year, barely trying to keep our operations going. Add to that the current situation, where a couple of months ago, the duty rates were changed because of the U.S. coalition of softwood lumber producers. They negotiated a deal with their government to impose an additional, I don't have the exact number with me here, but close to more than 20% of anti-dumping duty, on top of already an existing duty rate that we paid of 14.5%. So Brink had been paying up to about 3 months ago 14.5% duty rate, and somewhat lesser before that, but totally amounting to $70 or $80 million up to that point. And then the added anti-dumping based on 3 or 4 companies that had been dumping below the cost of production is dumping in the U.S. market. The U.S. coalition of softwood lumber producers was able to convince their government to add anti-dumping, including to value-added manufacturers that have no subsidy, no handouts or nothing. So our duty rate today is 35.19%. That is duty. Some of the majors have less. Some of the other big major, West Fraser has 26%. God only knows why, because of the calculation. They're paying less duties than we do. We have no timber. The allegation of the U.S. Softwood Lumber Coalition is they're being subsidized on timber prices. They are lower than they should be, and on stumpage payments and all of those kind of things. We don't have timber. We have no stumpage. We get no handouts, no subsidy. Not one nickel. Not one nickel. Nothing. But our 400 employees are on the verge of losing their jobs. Why? Incompetence on the part of, and with all due respect, I love the people that step up to the place, but they only talk to people like the Council of Forestry and the BC Lumber Trade Council. They are controlled by 2 or 3 operators, and that's who they are. And again, the Minister of Forestry is going to go to Japan and then to China, and they are only interested in buying high-grade products. You can go there as much. Open the door outside of your office and look outside the province of British Columbia. That's where we want to add value. That's what I've been saying for 50 years. That's what I've been saying today. And as the industry collectively is at the verge of caving in, and the government is making concessions, I believe it was announced last week that they will pause, whatever that means, stumpage payments. Americans are not going to like that. Give them more a case for subsidies and on and on and on. And then the federal government announced help in terms of announcing $1.2 billion in help and assistance to the forest industry across Canada. $500 million towards investing in new establishments, and $700 million to help companies that have been challenged. Now, the little that I know about it is that talking to the Minister of Forest and the Chief of Staff, they are scheduled to go to Ottawa on the 18th and the 19th now next week, I believe, to find out how much of the money will be designated to British Columbia. Meaning, they will make the case that we produce 50% of all the lumber manufactured in Canada. So, and making the case that 50% of the 1.2 billion should be designated to be selected out by the government of British Columbia. If that were the case, then again, using the same an observation that if half of the volume, but was designated to BC. So the objective was to take 700 million investing in companies that are challenged by duties and the related things, in particular in forest industry. Then that would mean $1.2 billion, 500 going into further manufacturing and investment. So 250 million would be designated there. Of the 700 million, 350 million would be made available to companies that are challenged now by the existing duties and the downturn in the economy, in the United States in particular, and subsequently in the forest industry here, as well as in the United States. So if that were the case, then already, as they say, the word on the street is that between Kofi and the BC Lumber Trade Council, that seems to be the voice of BC government here these days, and apparently government federally, value-added manufacturers that have no subsidy, have no timber, have no stumpage, have nothing, I say nothing, are being excluded. Why? I ask you, why? And so that that brings me more to today. What are the challenges? The challenges primarily are, and again, let's call a spade, is that obviously, and not being political, in the United States, obviously the US government, under the direction of the President Trump, have decided to, in particular, apply tariffs in a general sense. So we have been exposed to tariffs as well, in addition to duties, and maybe the same will happen again. Who knows? I don't think he even knows until he wakes up in the morning, with all due respect. So that is creating a problem. The duties on lumber in particular, we would have to pay 31 and a half, we would have to pay 35%, 35 point something percent duties. If we did, how does that look, John? Okay, let me give you an example. Last year, we paid about $20 million in duties on operating in a normal fashion. That was on the basis of 14.5%. If that is applied to now 35% this year, last year we paid 20 million. That would mean this year, in our financial year, and starts April the 1st, April till April 26th, we would have to pay $50 million in duties alone, 30 million more than we paid last year. Cannot be done. So you can well imagine how I feel about it in Canada, in BC. So the minister's running around and going to Japan, they only want to buy high grades. You want to go to China, only low grades. Kofi is only interested in financing their organization. Most of the people there are, I used to be the longest serving director. I was the vice chair. I left in frustration, absolute utter frustration. They don't appear to give a damn about communities, about the regions or anything else, just their own jobs. And I'm being very blunt about it apparently, but it is what it is. So then, what do we do? And then the other part about it is the 1.2 billion in terms of handouts. It has already, the word on the street is good informed sources saying that only applies to the primaries. Secondaries, that should be, if anything, be get it first, are being excluded. At the same time, what the government of British Columbia has done is they paused, whatever that means, stumpage payments. Why are we doing all of this to support a sector that has not been very supportive of value-added manufacturing in the province of British Columbia? That's where the future is. Innovative primary, that's where we have to go. Innovative primary in combination with intensive secondary. Supporting communities in regions and working closely with First Nations. That's what we do. In terms of finding financial partners that are obviously challenged by all of this as well, have been very supportive up to this point for the value-added sector, but obviously it's becoming more and more difficult for them to justify it. So how do I see it going forward? I see that as we are sitting here, I believe it's the 12th or so of September. I believe on the 17th, which is next Wednesday, the US will announce their federal interest rate, and I believe they hopefully will reduce it and can justify to reduce it by 25 basis points. I believe that they will need to go as far as 75 basis points and maybe even 1%. I understand that going beyond that in political involvement, I know the President Trump would like to see it go to 1%, but it is now at 4%. I believe that would be challenging the dominance of the US in terms of credibility of the Fed rate and the dollar and all of those kind of things. So, but I believe if I had to speculate, they will reduce it by 75 basis points. What do I know? But I'm just looking at what will that do? It will then push up, hopefully, home building. Home building in the United States normally is 1.5 million. Homes being built, it is now more or less like 900,000. Why? Because people have no confidence and uncertainty. And the inflation rate will go up. Duties, are in terms of tariffs, no matter how we pull it, squeeze it, at the end of the day, the people that are the buyers will pay for it. History shows us that over and over and over again. And it will be this time in that as well. In terms of duties on timber and lumber, I believe they did the right reason, they had the correct comments for the wrong reason. What they wanted to do is reduce the volume of lumber being manufactured in Canada so that the US companies that manufactured lumber would have a supply and demand sets price, their prices would go up. But I sometimes question these days with a lot of the bigger companies now in BC have found locations in the southeastern United States, and as they are sitting around the tables with government in Canada, federal or provincial, I say, which flag is on the table today? Which one is it? If I look at northern BC, it's a graveyard of sawmills all around us, between Fort Nelson, Fort St. John, Bear Lake, Fraser Lake, Vanderhoof, Houston, and I can go on and on and on. We used to have 120 sawmills, now it's less than 60. Value-added manufacturers, it's virtually, we used to have 800, now we have less than 25% of that. Maybe 200. And a lot of them are in deep, deep trouble because we cannot afford to add more social and economic value here. When there is a possibility of access to funds being located by the federal government, 1.2 billion, it is already agreed on the street. Credible sources say value-added manufacturers are excluded. I must say I'm getting so immensely pissed off with it, and I take the liberty, I usually don't do that, but I'm getting very, very frustrated with it. And so, how about the Americans then? Softwood lumber the Softwood Lumber Manufacturers Association has been very, very effective in working with government, the Senate and the House, in terms of convincing them that duties on softwood lumber imported from Canada is being subsidized and it is hurting their industry, blah, 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 and all of those kind of things. The reality is that it shows the unfairness of this for them. They are fully aware of it, that if you include value-added manufacturing, then it is not making the case for you as being unfairly affected by dumping. Value-added manufacturers are competing with your secondary manufacturers on that material and to punish them, which you are doing, it shows that you are indifferent to the benefit of your buyers, but that your interest is only to your association that are represented in primarily the US Southeast. And you, our American friends watching us, you will pay the price. Because there is no question about it that no matter what, and I don't want to beat up on anybody, but the fact is that if, which it will, the US starts building again to where they have to be, meaning interest rates will come down so people have confidence and they can afford rather than paying 7% duty or mortgage fees, they will build again. And if you do, your parks will not be mowed down and sawmills will not be located there. You will be short. You will be short 30 to 40% of the lumber volume that you need to build houses. And you need a market condition, and likely, even if that happens, lumber prices likely will go up to $1,000 a thousand. If you don't do that, then it may go to double that because supply and demand sets price. You cannot build without access to timber and lumber. So my message at this point is simply to the Canadians watching me, stand up, speak out. You know, we need value-added manufacturing, innovative primaries in combination with intensive secondaries. I've said that for 50 years. We have this absolutely beautiful province that grows this immense fiber. It's the best in the world. It's not like southern yellow pine. It's just apples and oranges. Southern yellow pine grows about 30 years. The growth rings are about that big. I said you have to drill it before you nail it. And so that's what it is. It's suitable for some things, but not for building in a general sense. The Canadian lumber, in particular in northern BC, but other parts of Canada as well, are the best product for building in the traditional way. But it can go much further with that. Rather than sending the wood to China, the low grades, let's make sure we can manufacture it here. And in terms of going to China, they only buy the higher grades. That's always been that way. It will never change. I think the government, both federally and provincially, open the door to your office and look outside. Where is the opportunity for value-added manufacturing in the communities, in the regions of this amazing, amazing province that we have? And as long as you open the door and listen to a few major producers that used to be located here, that still have most of the timber rights, including the companies that went down south, between them, and let's talk about the volume of the timber that we have. Even today still, our annual allowable cut in the province of British Columbia is still 65 million cubic meters annually. But we try to get to, the government's objective is, let's try to log 45 million cubic meters so that at least we can preserve part of our industry. But even that part they are not successful in delivering. And so what do they deliver? It's probably somewhere around 20, 25 million feet and probably below 20 million cubic meters. Why? Good question. Ask them. Ask them. And then, so where can it be, but where should it be? It should be, First Nations should be more involved. We should preserve sawmills that we have. Brink has been trying to buy sawmills or working with First Nations to work on primary manufacturing in combination with secondary manufacturing and go in that direction. Utter frustration because obviously it doesn't fit the model of either COFI or the BC Lumber Trade Council. And apparently if they are listened to by the government of British Columbia and the federal government, we will have no more value-added manufacturing. We just have a few spaghetti manufacturers left. And so it will probably take and bring us back to H.R. Macmillan, that submitted then became the largest manufacturer in the province of British Columbia. He say, if we go to the point, which we did, he was right, then it'd be a bad day for the province of British Columbia. We did. With all the timber that we have, and all the locations, and all the infrastructure, all the people that we had, it would take genius to screw it up. I submit to you in respect, we did. Let's now look at it in fairness, and hopefully, before the secondary manufacturing sector has caved in, and the primaries are not far behind them. The next ones to go down will be the medium-sized primaries, and several in this region and other regions. And I say, it may sound somewhat radical from my perspective, I have an obligation to speak out, and I do. And if that means, again, that I'm being looked at as a rebel and that I should be put out of business, it is what it is, but I have an obligation to stand up and speak out after 60 years working in British Columbia with the dream of building manufacturing facilities, innovative primary in combination with intensive secondary, stimulate trades. That's why I supported the College of New Caledonia that honored me with the John A. Brink Trades and Technology Center. That's why I was so active in supporting the University of Northern British Columbia, and that's why I'm still very, very active working with First Nations. But I cannot stand by in silence any longer and not speak up about it. And so that's where we are. We have huge potential. But unless we look at the issues, and unless we look at a long-term strategic plan, not the next 2 years, not the next 3 years, not having Kofi and the BC Lumber Trade Council dictate what the policy should be, but have a strategic plan that is agreed on by the government of British Columbia, in particular, the Conservatives and the NDP, for the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, 60 years. That must be part of what we do. If we do that, we will look forward to, in the next, we have enough timber. Fly over the province of British Columbia, all you see is timber. We have to work on all the elements. First, how do we attract entrepreneurship? How do we attract capital? How do we create consistency? How do we eliminate where 10 or 50% of all the timber in the province of British Columbia that is available, of the 20 or 25 million, not the 65 million that is the annual allowable cut, could be, not the 45 million that the government wants to do, they're not even close to that, but if 50% of that is controlled by 2 or 3 companies, that's not the right way to go. Use it or lose it is the first step. Have the balls to say enough already. This system doesn't work. And if you do that, then you will have a forest industry. It may take 5, 10, 20 years. You still then have people like myself, entrepreneurs, that lay awake at night and say, what can I do to create an industry that is second to none? We have the best timber in the world, the best location in the world, the best infrastructure, the best people, all the way around. But we must have politicians that are prepared to stand up, fight, and including with the United States in regards to tariffs, and particularly in duties as they apply to the secondary manufacturers. I say, go there, balls in hand, and say, we're going to fight. And then develop the policy for us and for our children in the long term. Thank you.